Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice, a publishing division of the Association of College and Research Libraries. This four-part series is brought to you with support from SAGE. These days, we find ourselves in a perfect storm of growing mistrust in science and a proliferation of misinformation. As we get past our incredulousness at this state of affairs, some of us are realizing that we need to turn the spotlight on the specialists who create, investigate, collect, and protect established scientific information. SAGE and Sense About Science, an organization that promotes the importance of science and scientific evidence to the general public, have released a report that pulls together those very same stakeholders, publishers, journalists, and librarians, to highlight the important roles these information curators play in today's information ecosystem. Joining the program to discuss the report called The People's Case for Curators and the Critical Importance of Curating Scientific Information for the Public Good are Tracey Brown, the Director of Sense About Science, Louis Coiffé-Gunn, CEO of the Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals, and Camille Gamboa, Associate Vice President of Corporate Communications at SAGE. In this first episode of the series, we're introduced to Sense About Science, and we discuss how it collaborated with SAGE on the report, and we define the role of a public good curator. All right, Tracey, Camille, welcome to the program.
Hello.
Hi, great to be
Hello.
here.
Great. Okay, so Tracey, can you tell us about Sense of Science? What's its mission and what is your role there as director?
So we promote the public interest in sound science and evidence, which sounds like a very big and grand remit, and it certainly is a big remit. What that means in practice is we equip the public with good questions, and we work out with people how to answer something in a structured way, how to find good sources, and then we work with researchers and all parts of the research communication community to help to answer public questions. So we're effectively enlarging that space, enlarging that conversation in public life that people can be involved in. And we look at what might impede that, things like people feeling intimidated from that space, or things becoming very politicized, or secrecy, algorithms that we can't see, and all those sorts of areas where we're just not having a frank discussion about the evidence we have and how well it serves our purpose.
Mm-hmm. And is your organization looking at this globally, or are you going where you see the issues, or how are you?
Our head office is in the UK, but we have big partnerships around the world, and we tend to work, I think, globally on issues like this, where we can see that there's something that different people can draw from.
Right.
We always actually check out, even where we have something like this project on Curators, where we're focusing on research-intensive environments. But we've also checked that out. We talk to people in many countries around the world where we're doing other work and say, how's this for you? Could you use this in some way? And so we have a lot of collaboration. The thing to remember is that there is a fairly universal element to the need for good information.
Yeah.
And whilst we have great differences in our societies, but what's good in Canada is good in Kenya when it comes to libraries and people who will help us find reliable information.
Yes, excellent, good. So let's talk about the guide that recently came out. Sense About Science and SAGE recently released a guide called The People's Case for Curators, which, quote, advocates the role of information curators as they help people navigate today's complex information landscape. Can you both provide a little background on the guide? How did it come together? And Camille, why don't we start with you?
Sure, yeah. So we actually originally conceived of the idea of the report over a year ago. The world looked different back then. At that point in time, trust in science was actually starting to look up. It actually took a dip during the pandemic, as you might imagine. But if you look at data from the end of last year, it started to look up. And so we were going to really accelerate that trust with this project by creating a tool that would, lift the curtain to expose how information is curated in hopefully a very easily digestible way, with the goal of increasing trust in science and ultimately, at least for SAGE, the goal of increasing use of science in public life. Of course, since 2025, things have been looking even more complicated, and the need for the guide is even greater, in my opinion.
Right.
Not only are we facing more challenges to trust in science because of like the inside baseball challenges of research integrity, paper mills, mass retractions, that seems to just becoming a bigger and bigger issue. But now we have added complications that are growing because of AI, of course, and then the growing politicization of science, at least, within the US, using scientific action for political gain. So at this point, it's even more important. We need to define what curation is and also define what a curator is, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's more important that we do that we define who those people are and what qualifies them to do that important work. So I couldn't be more thrilled that we signed on a year ago and are putting it out now.
Excellent. Yeah, over to you, Tracey. Like, how did you connect with Sage on this?
Well, yeah, I agree with all that Camille said. This is a conversation that's been going on for some time. And one of the things that really for us, I suppose the important point was there's so much that's invisible in the way that information arrives to us, and there's a lot of good stuff that's invisible, which is what the guide's all about, is making that much more visible. And there are a lot of people involved who are making quality judgments along the way, who are actually figuring stuff out for us, telling us, where we can find good things, what skills we need to find them and to understand them, and also just assessing what answers our questions well, what kind of evidence we need. And, at the same time, there's also a lot that's invisible that we should be thinking a lot more about, which is the way that information is arriving through our social media feeds and searches and search engines and so on, where decisions are being made about showing us stuff by algorithms, and really designed to keep our attention, to show us more advertising, for example. And it's not because we think there's real merit in showing someone who's for example anxious about their mental health pictures of people self-harming, and yet somewhere something is curating that information and providing it to people. So I think it was a good point of contrast, really, to say, look, there's so many more people who have effectively a public service ethos of what they do that we need to know about. But at the same time, we also need to become very aware of other ways in which information is reaching us that doesn't have anywhere near those kind of laudable goals that we could sign on to as a public.
Right. Excellent. Thank you, Tracey. Camille, you mentioned the sort of inside baseball issues that are constantly going on in the background, like the mass retractions, like you said. Like, how do those, even though maybe the general public doesn't really see those issues happening, how do they kind of compound or contribute to the the eroding trust issue in science and information?
Yeah, I mean, I think that actually they're hitting the mainstream media more and more these days. I mean, I was just doing, in preparation for this conversation, poking around, like, what are, and you see things in the New York Times and, all the biggest newspapers. But the problem with that is that, those things are very rare.
Yeah.
Like, we've got a very robust research integrity team at SAGE, and so do our colleagues at other publishers who are just doing the best work, to make sure not only that these things don't happen, but when they do happen, to take corrective action. And so it's really important. So one of the groups of people that we'll talk about in this report is research integrity experts, and either within universities or publishers. But anyway, it's really important that we, as Tracey was saying, show this invisible work to the public, because those cases are rare, and there are experts there when they do arise to help prevent them and to stop negative consequences that come from those bad acting scientists when things do end up getting through.
Right. Yeah. It only takes one faulty report to get through, and folks will tend to jump on that as a, you know, as the example.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that just to add to that, I think that obviously in certain contexts those things become more weaponized.
Hmm.
And so, what could be understood as a fairly low failure rate, given, I mean, the huge number of scholarly papers that are published each year, and that's obviously been a figure that's grown and grown really rapidly. We're talking about a relatively minor part of that, but
Right.
in the context of science more generally becoming weaponized around certain subjects, I think that these things get jumped on sometimes as evidence. Someone says follow the science, and someone says, well, look at this science. So I think giving people more insight into the human endeavor towards quality is a good thing, and it helps
Hmm.
people to understand not just that this is happening, first of all, because I don't think it's really understood. I mean, just fundamentally, we work with the public a lot, sense about science. It's news to people that there's this thing called peer review.
Hmm.
It's and one of the first conversations we have is that scientific or scholarly information is different to other types of information. It's not like a corporate press release or a political manifesto statement or a piece of marketing. It's a very different product, and
Hmm.
that in itself is a really important thing to showcase and to talk about, as well as then all the other decisions about where we pick up information to find it relevant to the question that we have and how we get there and who helps us along the way. So I think that's really a valuable thing to do. And my experience is that the public broadly can understand that in that process, sometimes things will go wrong, and that most processes are open to being gamed in some way. But I think you need to understand the process is there first and foremost to then put into context what you might be hearing in these sorts of stories about faulty research.
Exactly. Yeah. Um, Camille, talk about Sage's stake in this. Why did um, Sage see, or how did Sage see its position as a publisher contributing to the guide's goals?
Yeah. Yeah, so we really believe in Sense About Science's mission, which is, to bring out to the public what the value of science is and build trust in science. Ultimately, because we believe in the use of science, we believe that the best policy making, the best business operations, the best decision making, all comes from um, when it all comes about when it's based in science, and so our goal in building trust in science is ultimately to build use in science. And then I just really liked the way when we were approached by Sense About Science, we really became partners on
Hmm.
this. We were happy to fund it, of course, but also we were thought partners, and we talked about parts of the curation process that are within the publishing realm. We talked about the role of editors. We talked about the role of research integrity experts, as I mentioned before, and talked about, and then after publication, the different curation that happens as well. So we have a deep stake in it because we are a part of this process.
Hmm.
And we want people to understand, everything that happens prior and post publication to get good information to the public. So yeah, it was a great partnership because of that and more.
Excellent. Yeah, and Tracy, I imagine being able to pair up with a publisher kind of hammers home your Sense About Science's mission as well, in terms of getting information out to the public and kind of showing the halo effect of having a publisher on your side with that.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
we are small and our mission is enormous.
Mhm.
And
Exactly.
so
Right.
the only way for us to progress with it is to find partnerships that
Mhm.
really, I would say this has been a partnership that's more than the sum of its parts.
Mhm.
And so we've really valued that, and also aligns well on values. I mean, Sage has got a strong reputation for independence,
Right.
and I think also a very big track record in democracy and human rights as well, which I think is a part of this. Understanding that science is about helping communities. It's part of a democratic society. It's part of helping communities to openly and honestly talk about evidence and what decisions we might base on it, and how robust they are. And we see in many parts of the world that people don't have the freedom to make those types of decisions. I mean, I worked in Russia in the 1990s when it was opening up, and people were for in the post-Soviet era beginning to ask questions about the society they lived in and ask them scientifically and describe their world in statistics. And I really experienced that freedom to talk openly about evidence and to talk about what we can trust. Do we believe the toxicology tests that show the river's not polluted, or do we not? Those types of discussions. I felt that kind of ethos sits certainly behind my own motivation. But I think I see a lot of that in the way that SAGE thinks about its community partnerships as well.
Yeah, excellent.
Just to add quickly on that, if I may,
of course,
this is the things that Tracey were just talking about are, these are wicked societal issues that are not going to be, addressed, solved in any way in tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
And so what I liked about what both Sense About Science and SAGE have is this long-term perspective of that doesn't mean we need to give up on it. SAGE, as Tracey mentioned, is independent, which means that we don't have to answer to next quarter's earnings or next quarter's share prices. We can think long term and chip away at this and make slight improvements. And we see those kinds of efforts as valuable as well.
Yeah, excellent. So we can kind of move into the more practical topics around the report itself. So why don't we start with defining what a public good curator is? Who can be one, and what is their responsibility, and how does that coincide with public trust in science? And Tracey, why don't we start with you on that?
Well, it's a strange language to use. Let's say that at first. I mean, curation, it feels like we're talking in a 19th century language. And I think that in itself it is pointing to the fact that we haven't spent enough time, talking about this part of our sort of architecture around knowledge, because we haven't got modern words for a lot of the things that people do, or we need to make them popular again. So, I mean, a lot of our focus is on librarians and librarianship. And I think because that's a very good starting place for the public to start thinking. It makes sense. If you start talking about, research integrity officers, or it requires a bit of explanation. But I think starting with that, and there are a lot of people for whom the library was, quite profound, whether that was a university library or a community library, that they understand that that's something that's on their side. That it's about feeding their desire, whether it's their curiosity or their need for information or their thirst for knowledge, or their education. The library plays that role, and that, I think, made it very important for us to talk about librarians, and then to sort of start thinking about the principles that sit behind librarianship, and also other selection of information, like for quality purposes, such as we thought about editors and the decisions that they make, where again they're thinking about the needs of their audience and the availability of the information and the scientific studies that might be relevant, and connecting those. And we broadened it from there to think about others who share those principles of independence and quality, and thinking about the information they're sourcing.
Yeah, and journalists were part of that, creating sort of that trifecta of trustful information dissemination. And I just love that combination. Camille, do you want to talk a little bit about what went into kind of defining those roles?
Yeah. So I think the approach that we took was unique in that we just went to, dozens of the curators themselves. So we had roundtables with different categories of curators: editors, research integrity officers, academic librarians, and journalists. And we asked them, what kind of function, how they perform their functions, why it matters. And it was really interesting that we could come up with these themes. There's actually a definition in the report that I really like. It says that curators are individuals committed to transparency about where they source and how they evaluate information. They help society navigate our world's complex information landscape by protecting pathways to trustworthy answers and inviting good questioning. So you see themes there across all of the groups of curators of transparency, sourcing good information, but also inviting good questioning, and inviting good critical thinking, and not telling people what to think.
Mm-hmm.
It was really great to hear that from them, that they have these things in common that I know the public would appreciate.
Right. I'm curious. I can't help but ask. When you were considering adding the journalist class to the grouping here, um, especially in America with the whole fake news stuff that's going on, that I can see exactly why journalists were selected as curators. But they also kind of in this moment are coming to the equation with their own, I guess, trust issues. I'm wondering if that was ever part of your deliberations in kind of putting this guide together.
Well, of course, but I think what we have to do is sometimes remind people of the more laudable ends of what they do. It's worth also pointing out that specialist journalists, which is what we've highlighted in the
Yes.
guide, are
Right.
a dying breed. That many outlets can, now facing, particularly in traditional media,
Yep.
facing sort of declines in advertising revenue and that kind of thing, are struggling to maintain a core of specialist journalists, which means as a public we start to lose out, because those are the people that can ask the penetrating questions, but can also go and they know how to find and source information, how they know how to read. For example, if you're a science journalist, you know how to read a scientific paper.
Right.
And so I think, they can test the credibility of sources in that kind of a way. And I think that's important to highlight. If we don't treasure some of these things, then we're going to lose them at a faster rate. I thought it was a story. It was interesting. I'm picking up what Camille's just saying. It was interesting to see that overlap, that commonality between the different curators as we pulled their commentary together and listened to them in the workshops, that they found common cause with each other. And at this time, and perhaps it's worth highlighting that, in some places, North America certainly being one, there's an element of demoralization that people are feeling in some of these sectors. And by bringing them together and showing them what they have in common, I think we start to contribute to strengthening people's morale in the face of bigger challenges.
That's an excellent point. I agree 100%. You just heard from Tracey Brown, the Director of Sense About Science, and Camille Gamboa, Associate Vice President of Corporate Communications at SAGE. Join us next week when we discuss key takeaways and action steps from the guide, the power of amplifying scientific evidence through journalists, publishers, and librarians, and how we can scale these messages to the general public. This 4-part series is brought to you with support from SAGE. The Authority File podcast is brought to you every week by Choice and produced by digital media producer Sabrina Kofer. Underwriting opportunities are directed by Melissa Carr and Ryan King. For more information, download the Choice Media Kit at choice360.org. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.